Welcome back to Founding Footprints. I'm the historian Ben Bernard from the University of Virginia. The topic of today's episode is the Black community in Albemarle and Charlottesville. I'll be speaking with Dr. Andrea Douglas, director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. I learned from her that it was founded as a freedmen's school in 1865 after the Civil War, but refounded in 1926 as a high school for African American students. The centenary of that institution is coming up in 2026. Today, it's a heritage center, kind of like a cross between an art and history museum and exhibition space, a performing arts venue, and a community center. What I love about this heritage center is that the building itself is an essential part of the heritage that it preserves, hence keeping Jefferson School and invoking that history in the name of the African American Heritage Center. So what does 1926 have to do with 1776? We're going to tie it back to America's founding by the end of the episode.
I'm Andrea Douglas, and I am the executive director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And that has existed in Charlottesville since 2013. I have been with the project since its origins. And so largely we have stewarded this history of the Black community in Albemarle and Charlottesville and created projects that display and discuss the larger relationship of African Americans to the local narrative, a global narrative, on and on.
So I noticed that if someone stopped after the first three words, they would think that it's a school.
Yes.
I'm guessing it used to be a school?
It used to be a school. So the Jefferson School has been in Charlottesville since 1865. It was formed as a freedmen's school. The Civil War ends in April, and by September, there is a freedmen's school that starts both as a normal school and starts as a graded school. So normal schools teach teachers. So if you want to think about the origins of education, decidedly, in this part of the world, the Jefferson School is right there at the moment. So ultimately, the history of the school begins in 1865 and continues until 1966, when it's turned into Charlottesville's integrated sixth grade. And so the African American Heritage Center is in the most southern part of the building. It is in the 1926 high school. In 1926, that portion building was developed as a consequence of a petition from parents and concerned people in 1921 that recognized that until the opening of that building, if you wanted a secondary education, meaning high school education in Charlottesville, past the age of 14, you would have to leave because you couldn't get one. In 1926, when the building opens, it's also a really sort of important moment in the history of Virginia politics, in that Virginia, in 1924, has created something called the Racial Integrity Act. And by 1926, they create an amendment to that act called the Public Assemblage Act. And that is actually the thing that makes it illegal for blacks and whites to occupy public space. So not only does the Jefferson School then represent what I like to call the democratization of education for black people, because now everyone can go, but the other thing then that it does establish in 1926 is the place where African American people can be solely in a place of their own. As the history of the building and the school continues, you're also seeing it as a history not just of the education space, but also of the public civic space, because that's where you could go to see concerts. That's where sometimes if the church needed repair, that's where they held church. By 1951, they build a high school that is now known as Burley Middle School, but Jackson P. Burley High School then becomes the second place of all black education, and Jefferson School becomes the elementary school. For many reasons, the histories that we tell encompass all of these ideas.
And so it sounds like the school at this moment, it has trade-offs. On the one hand, it provides access to a high school education. On the other hand, it's in a segregated environment.
Yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs in that. And I think that's also reflective in the physical plant of it. Why the Jefferson School is on the National Registry is because it is a intact representation of a state plan. When you think about all the other schools, they're actually not state plan schools. They're architecturally designed schools. Venable School is built essentially simultaneously with Jefferson School. The superintendent at the time, when he's talking about building Venable School, he says something like, I want the ideals of the University of Virginia to trickle down into the community. And so if you look at Venable School, outside of the fact that there was a fire, it is fairly an intact representation of that ideology. Johnson will build public schools for white education. 1934-38 is Clark School, and then there's Lane High School, which is now the county office building. And if you look at the architecture of all of those buildings, you will see that it is Jeffersonian Palladial architecture.
I'm starting to get a sense that maybe you have a PhD in art and art history and architecture, and you also have an MBA. I'm curious to know about how these two backgrounds come together in the work that you do at the African American Heritage Center.
Every single day. The things that we do, depending on who I'm talking to, are all about product lines. We don't define ourselves, for instance, as a museum, which is what people thought we were. We're an art and cultural heritage center. We have a contemporary gallery. We have our permanent installations, which are about the history. And those permanent installations are defined in particular kinds of ways, meaning you don't just walk in and find out about Charlottesville history. You find out about our local history in relationship to Virginia history, then in relationship to a national story.
What you did right off the bat at the Heritage Center is to take the institution to the broader community's concerns. And that seems to be a big trend in the museum world right now, in addition to the Heritage Center.
The conceptual space of museums and understanding that they have the possibility of being more than archival and collecting spaces, that they have the possibility of driving conversation. The thing about museums is they're not easily reactive or able to react to contemporary moments. It's play, it's experimentation, but it's not always easily understood. The middle of our space is a 2,500 square foot theater. I wanted to do August Wilson as a way of defining the Black experience in America. He is was the quintessential exhibitor from emancipation through the Black Power movement. And so that was created, and we had an opportunity to dig deeply into the idea of Black theater. It was 4 plays a year. It was the re-articulation in Black vernacular of Shakespeare. It was educating the community about what that vernacular looked like. It was the development of something called the Charlottesville Players Guild, which came out of a theatrical group that was associated with the Jefferson School in the 50s. And we had to actually ask the last living member of that group if we could have the name in order to do that.
What's amazing is to see how many different types of artistic media and different types of programming are running through the Heritage Center. You mentioned that there was this historic transition for the school in 1926 with the implementation of the segregated school system. What are you planning for the Centennial? What can visitors to the school expect to see? What are the stakes of the Centennial for you?
When I first came to the Jefferson School, what compels me every single day to come to work is this story. It's the story of the people who work here, who went to school there. It's the ways in which these people built a community despite desired exclusion of them. Right, in the community. The very first piece of property, for instance, that a Black person purchases in Charlottesville, just in 1867, and it's purchased by Isabella Gibbons and her husband, William Gibbons. Right, Isabella and William were both enslaved at the university. Isabella is the first Black teacher at the Jefferson School, and she's my hero. The minute I heard Isabella's story, I wanted to know what it sounded like. When I was at the university, they had done this thing with Bill T. Jones for one of the anniversaries of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And so Bill T. Jones came and mounted a huge community project in the city. So I want to write the symphony for the Heritage Center. There are significant women who have moved this community forward. There's a woman named Otelia Jackson. She's a young woman. In 1918, the city of Charlottesville creates an NAACP. Everyone in the larger narrative thinks it started in 1949 here. That's when it coalesced. But in 1918, those people associated with the Jefferson School came together. They wrote a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois asking to form an NAACP, and the secretary is Otelia Jackson. And she continues her life as a woman deeply engaged in voter registration. That's 1918. The 19th Amendment is not till 1920. And that conviction and that understanding of the importance and the power of a vote, those are the kinds of people who are represented within this larger narrative that we tell.
So the centenary of the school in 1926 to 2026 is also the centenary of this era of thinking about voting in between emancipation and civil rights. We have this 1920s moment.
In Virginia, the 1902 Constitution is basically the Constitution that nails in this notion of what some of us call legalized apartheid. Virginia doesn't get a new constitution until the 70s. But the consequences of the history of black people, Albemarle County had 300 plantations in there. 14,000 people were enslaved here. That is a significant marker of the history of the beginning of what we understand to be this period of racial histories, right? And Charlottesville is deeply embedded in that. Going to 1950s, Charlottesville has an NAACP of 96. Within 2 years, it's 1,500. When we tell our story, we're not talking about massive resistance. We're talking about the growth of the NAACP and activism and the ways in which a community can coalesce in order to drive change.
I want to go back to the Virginia Constitution and how the institution fits into this longer history in Virginia. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which very famously is written by the same guy whose name is on your Heritage Center, Thomas Jefferson. And we're interested in thinking about the meaning of that anniversary in Charlottesville today. I noticed that you co-chaired the University of Virginia's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation, and that with Kurt Von Dock, who's a friend of this podcast, you co-edited a book together on that subject as well. You guys wrote in the introduction, quote, "By the early 20th century, the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, and Albemarle County had reimagined themselves as an idyllic landscape steeped in a revolutionary era." Could you tell us about this era of segregation's imagined connection to the Age of Revolutions, to the founding of America?
So 1920 is the resurgence of the Klan in Virginia, in Richmond. And that Klan is divided between the Anglo-Saxon Club and the Ku Klux Klan. And the Anglo-Saxon Club ultimately grows to be sort of the elite of this mechanism of Jim Crow in that moment. Members of the Anglo-Saxon Club are university professors. The university is creating and defining this idea of eugenics. Eugenics is grounded in a scientific racism.
And are they thinking about the Revolutionary Era?
They're thinking about it in the same terms that you would think about it as an Enlightenment era. Jefferson is an Enlightenment figure. The ways in which he's thinking about the world, those are Enlightenment ideals, ground in a sort of sense of reclamation. We're beginning to see notions of the City Beautiful movement are all about the ideas of rationalism, rational meaning white, and what one does in order to reclaim those kinds of ideas. That's revolution, right, in some ways.
So they're kind of mobilizing this legacy, memories of classical antiquity and of the Revolution as part of their own political conflicts around race a century ago.
I think that's a good way of sort of articulating it. But I also think that when one starts to see, even within this construct of that duality between the rational and the irrational, the irrational is where African American people live and have lived as a consequence of these discourses that even allow for enslavement. And so at that very moment in the 1920s, that's what you're really starting to understand. And they're putting objects in spaces that symbolically define that. It's, power versus powerless. There is this binary that's articulated in who has the right to what even. And what symbols then identify those kinds of things.
Is it a problem for you that Thomas Jefferson's name is on the Heritage Center?
No, it's not. It's a historic fact because the woman, Anna Gardner, she's an abolitionist, and she comes from Nantucket, and she's the first teacher. And she believes in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. We all should believe in the ideals. How that is translated is the problem. It's not the words that are the problem. It's our capacity to live up to those words.
Last question. I heard that there might be a digital visitor experience.
It's really a self-guided tour. What's exciting to me about it is that we can take all of our exhibitions and turn them into 15 different languages. The most recent part of our permanent installation, that part of it is called Towards a Lineage of Self. There are 120 stories on that. There are 120 more stories that are not there. We have multiple capacities to bring this history broadly and add to them. You need to hear and see their lives. So we can add documents to it. We can add oral histories to it. We can add deeds to it. So here's the history of all their property. Here's the history of that property when it no longer belongs to them. Those are the kinds of things that we can provide, and we're hoping that it will be ready in the fall. One of my goals is to sort of 3D model in some way the history of the African American community, and this thing will allow me to do it.
I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I've learned so much about not just the institution, but the history of Charlottesville. So thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Douglas, for coming in to speak with me today.
Thank you for listening.
At the beginning of this episode, I promised we'd try to connect 1926 back to 1776. First, of course, is the name. The school is part of Jefferson's legacy in the region. Jefferson, of course, was an enslaver, but also admired by women like Anna Gardner, who Dr. Douglas mentioned as the first teacher at this new secondary school for Black students. So this is maybe a kind of paradox, but I think both of these can be true. The second way to understand the connection between America's founding and these two moments in 1865 and 1926 is the perspective of the historian Eric Foner, who titled his recent book about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, The Second Founding. And we might consider Reconstruction after the Civil War as a second founding because of the ways that the founding ideals about democracy and equality, debates over citizenship, were renegotiated in the aftermath of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. So here I asked University of Virginia historian Gillette Rosenblith for more context. She described how Black soldiers returning from World War I sought greater rights in the new Negro movement. And this political movement coincided with the Harlem Renaissance in popular culture. Yet white Americans were scared and angry. This is a moment when white men enact horrific mob violence on Black communities, and especially veterans across the USA in 1919. And they passed more Jim Crow laws, such as the 1924 Racial Integrity Act that Dr. Douglas mentioned. This is a law that prohibits interracial marriage and tries to create definitions of what it means to be a white person. It's during this period that Confederate statues were erected to inscribe on the landscape the values of these racist and often eugenicist movements. These were intended to identify with the Lost Cause movement at the time of these strict laws circumscribing Black people's access to public space under Jim Crow. For example, a bronze equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, which was dedicated in 1924, just 2 years before the founding of the Jefferson School. Following the violent Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, a white supremacist gathering organized in opposition to dismantling those statues, the Robert E. Lee statue itself was melted down, and it is the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center that is entrusted with its remnants, finding artists to remake works using those materials. I'd like to thank Dr. Andrea Douglas, Carla Mullen from the Charlottesville Albemarle Convention and Visitors Bureau, and UVA historian Gillette Rosenblith. And thank you for listening.
Founding Footprints is a VA 250 project. America, made in Virginia. This podcast is a production of the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM, hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard, with sound design by Sage Tanguay, editing by Ella Powell, and music provided by Blue Dot Sessions. If you'd like to explore the history of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, you can find more information at visitcharlottesville.org. Virginia is for history lovers.